Number 1. Thomas Greer. An 80-year-old man walks into his own home carrying nothing but his house keys. Within minutes, he is on the floor, being beaten by two strangers half his age. Within the hour, one of them will be dead, and the last word she ever says to him will turn out to be a lie. This is the story of Tom Greer. To understand what happened on that July night in 2014, you have to first understand the neighborhood it happened in. Bixby Knolls is one of Long Beach, California's older, established residential pockets. A grid of modest single-family homes built decades earlier, tree-lined streets. The kind of community where longtime residents know each other by name and where a break-in is still considered rare enough to shake an entire block. Tom Greer had lived on Country Club Drive for years. Neighbors described him as reserved but friendly, a man who kept to himself but who would step outside without hesitation if something seemed wrong on the street. One neighbor, George Romero, later told reporters that he had first met Greer years earlier after Greer's front door had been kicked in during an earlier burglary. Romero had come running to check on him, and the two had been friendly acquaintances ever since. That detail matters, because by the summer of 2014, Greer's home had already been targeted multiple times. Prosecutors would later describe him as a man who had endured at least 2, and by his own account possibly as many as 4, separate burglaries at the same address in a relatively short span of time. For an elderly man living alone, that is not simply a property crime. It is a slow erosion of the one place that is supposed to be safe. Each break-in chips away at the sense of security a home is meant to provide. By the time July arrived, Greer had begun to suspect that the same people were responsible for each incident and that they might return again. He was right. On Tuesday, the 22nd of July, 2014, at approximately 8:55 in the evening, Greer pulled into his driveway on the 3900 block of Country Club Drive. It had been an ordinary day. He parked, gathered his belongings, and walked through his front door into a home that was, unbeknownst to him, no longer empty. Waiting inside were two people, 28-year-old Andrea Miller and 26-year-old Gus Polly Adams. According to the charge evaluation worksheet later filed by prosecutors, the pair had entered the home with the clear intention of robbing it, and Greer's early arrival caught them still in the act. Rather than flee, they turned on him. Greer was thrown to the ground almost immediately. What followed was not a brief scuffle. Prosecutors say Miller continued to strike him repeatedly while Adams turned his attention to Greer's home safe, working methodically to break it open, seemingly unconcerned that the homeowner was being beaten just feet away. Compounding the danger of the situation, Greer was not merely outnumbered inside his own home. He was effectively sealed inside it. According to prosecutors, Adams's mother and a child, both allegedly participating in the burglary as lookouts or logistical support, were positioned near the front door, blocking what would have been Greer's most direct route to escape or to summon help. An 80-year-old man, alone, injured, was trapped in a structure he had lived in for years, now transformed into something closer to a hostage situation than a simple robbery. At some point in the encounter, Miller stopped beating Greer and turned to help Adams finish forcing open the safe. Inside, the two found roughly $5,000 in cash, money they intended to take and split between themselves. It was in this brief lull, this shift of attention away from him and toward the safe, that Greer found his opening. Battered, likely disoriented, and with what would later be confirmed as a broken collarbone from the assault, he managed to reach his firearm, a .22 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. What happened in the moments that followed has been reconstructed from Greer's own statements to police and to the media, as well as from the physical evidence gathered at the scene. As Miller and Adams attempted to flee the home, their robbery interrupted, their victims suddenly armed, Greer began firing. By his own account, Miller was not as fast as her accomplice in getting away. Greer said he shot her twice in the back as she ran, while Adams managed to escape into a nearby alley. In a detail that would only deepen the chaos of that night, Adams reportedly returned briefly to the scene, not to help his accomplice, but, according to prosecutors, to grab Greer's dropped cell phone and his firearm before finally fleeing for good, making his way to a getaway vehicle allegedly driven by his then 49-year-old mother. It is what happened in Miller's final moments that transformed this case from a local crime story into a piece of national news. As she went down, wounded, prosecutors say she begged Greer not to shoot her again, telling him that she was pregnant, that she was going to have a baby. In an interview given shortly after the incident, Greer recounted her words plainly and recounted his response with the same bluntness. He said he shot her anyway. Andrea Miller did not survive her injuries. Days later, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office released the result of her autopsy, and it delivered a finding that shocked much of the public following the story. Andrea Miller had not been pregnant. Whatever purpose her final words served in that desperate, fatal moment, they were not true. The revelation ignited fierce and immediate public debate. Long Beach Police Chief Jim McDonnell addressed reporters in the days following the shooting, carefully laying out the legal framework that would ultimately determine Greer's fate. Under California law, he explained, a homeowner is permitted to use force, including deadly force, when they reasonably believe they are in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death. But McDonnell was equally clear that prosecutors would need to closely examine whether Greer's actions, specifically the shots fired as Miller and Adams were already fleeing the home, still fell within those legal boundaries, or whether they crossed into territory the law would no longer protect. That question, whether force used against a retreating, no longer immediately threatening intruder can still be considered lawful self-defense, became the central legal and ethical debate of the entire case. It is a question that shows up again and again throughout the history of self-defense law. The law generally protects a person acting under genuine, immediate threat, but that protection becomes far murkier once the threat has begun to withdraw. In the days following the shooting, the investigation expanded. Gus Adams, the surviving accomplice, was tracked down and arrested on the Wednesday following the incident, taken into custody on suspicion of residential burglary and, remarkably, murder, a charge made possible under the same legal principle that would appear again and again throughout cases like this one. When a person participates in a violent felony, like an armed home invasion, and a death results from that crime, the law in many states allows prosecutors to hold every participant accountable for that death, regardless of who actually fired the fatal shots. By the Friday after the shooting, Adams was formally charged with murder, residential robbery, residential burglary, grand theft of a firearm, and possession of a firearm by a felon, a lengthy list of charges reflecting the severity with which prosecutors viewed his role in the events that led to Miller's death. He was held on bail exceeding $1 million. That same week, investigators arrested a third suspect, Adams's 49-year-old mother, Ruby Adams, accused of participating in the burglary, allegedly by helping block the front entrance and by driving her son away from the scene after the shooting. Her arrest underscored just how coordinated the break-in appeared to have been. Not two opportunistic burglars, but a small, organized crew that had allegedly targeted Greer's home more than once. For months, the most consequential question of all remained unanswered. Would Tom Greer himself face criminal charges for killing Andrea Miller? Public opinion split sharply. Some viewed Greer as a victimized elderly man who had endured repeated home invasions and had finally been forced, in a moment of terror and pain, to defend himself with the only means available to him. Others, including at least one prominent newspaper columnist who wrote extensively and critically about the case, argued that Greer's decision to pursue the fleeing intruders, reportedly chasing them into the alley behind his home, gun still in hand, represented a fundamental legal problem. Once Miller and Adams were running away, this argument held, Greer was no longer defending himself from an active threat. He had, in the words of one widely circulated opinion piece, moved from self-defense into something closer to pursuit. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office spent months reviewing the case, weighing witness statements, physical evidence, and the legal nuances of California's self-defense statutes. Finally, in December of that year, prosecutors announced their decision. No charges would be filed against Tom Greer. Their review concluded that, in light of the violent assault Greer had already suffered, a beating serious enough to fracture his collarbone, and the broader context of an elderly man who had already been repeatedly victimized at the same address, his actions that night did not rise to the level of a criminal offense under California law. For Gus Adams, the outcome was starkly different. He remained in custody, held on his substantial bail, facing the full weight of charges tied not only to the burglary itself, but to the death of his own accomplice, a legal consequence of the so-called felony murder principle that exists, in various forms, across much of the United States. Tom Greer's case endures, more than a decade later, as one of the most frequently cited and most fiercely debated self-defense shootings in modern American legal history, not because the facts were simple, but precisely because they were not. It sits at the exact fault line between a homeowner's right to protect his property and person, and the legal limits placed on that right once the danger has begun to pass. It is a case that continues to be taught, discussed, and argued over in law school classrooms and cable news panels alike. A reminder that even when prosecutors decline to press charges, the moral and legal questions a case like this raises rarely resolve as cleanly as the paperwork does. If this case has you thinking about how differently a single night can end depending on the decisions made in it, make sure to like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts below, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case so you don't miss what's coming next, because the next case on this list is just as unforgettable. Number 2. Robert Rheams. A woman is asleep in her bed. Her 2 young children are asleep just steps away. In the darkness before dawn, a stranger who has already served 2 decades in prison walks silently past one of those sleeping children and straight toward her bedroom door. This is the story of Robert Rheams. Hammond, Louisiana sits in Tangipahoa Parish, a stretch of southeastern Louisiana known for its rolling countryside and small, tight-knit communities. The Hillside Mobile Home Park, located just outside town on Klein Road, is the kind of neighborhood where houses sit close together, where residents tend to know their neighbors, and where a shooting in the early morning hours is enough to bring an entire street out onto their porches by sunrise. That is exactly what happened on Sunday, the 8th of January, 2023. Shortly before 5 in the morning, the deepest, darkest hour of the night, when a household is at its most defenseless, a mother and her 2 young children were asleep inside their home on Klein Road. According to the Tangipahoa Parish Sheriff's Office, a 51-year-old man named Robert Rheams forced his way inside. He came prepared for violence, if not for a gunfight. Investigators say he was carrying both a shovel and a lug wrench, tools that, in his hands that night, had been repurposed as weapons. What makes the sequence of events inside that home especially disturbing is the path Rheams allegedly took once he was inside. Deputies say he walked directly past one of the woman's children, who was asleep on the living room sofa, without stopping, moving with apparent purpose straight toward the bedroom where the mother lay sleeping. She woke to find a stranger in her room. What followed was a violent, close-quarters struggle, the kind of encounter that leaves almost no time for thought, only reaction. According to statements later given to reporters by Sheriff's Office Chief of Operations Jimmy Travis, the woman fought back, driven by fear for her own life and for the lives of her 2 sleeping children just outside that bedroom door. In the midst of that physical altercation, she managed to retrieve a handgun. She fired a single shot. That one round struck Rheams in the thigh. On its face, not necessarily a catastrophic location for a gunshot wound. But the bullet had found his femoral artery, one of the largest and most critical blood vessels in the human body, responsible for carrying blood through the leg. Without immediate, highly specialized medical intervention, a femoral artery injury can lead to fatal blood loss within minutes. By the time deputies arrived at the home, Rheams was already down. He was pronounced dead at the scene by the Tangipahoa Parish Coroner's Office. In the hours and days that followed, investigators began working to understand exactly who Robert Rheams was, and the picture that emerged was troubling. Rheams was not a stranger to the criminal justice system. He had been released from prison less than a year earlier, in March of the previous year, after serving approximately 20 years of a 30-year sentence for an armed robbery. According to Sheriff's Office Chief Travis, that earlier crime had itself been deeply violent. Rheams was accused of entering a Hammond convenience store where a police officer happened to be present, producing a handgun, disarming the officer, and stealing both his weapon and the cash from the store's register. Rheams's criminal history extended back even further, including a drug distribution conviction from the 1990s and a theft conviction from around the same period as the armed robbery. Perhaps most alarming of all, investigators do not believe the home invasion in Hammond was an isolated act of violence that night. According to Travis, authorities linked Rheams to an attempted carjacking that occurred just hours before he broke into the woman's home. Evidence, investigators believed, that Rheems's final hours were marked by an escalating pattern of predatory violence that ultimately culminated in that bedroom on Klein Road. The Tangipahoa Parish Sheriff's Office was unambiguous in its public assessment of the shooting. In a statement released on the department's social media page, officials described the case as an example of a homeowner exercising her fundamental rights to protect herself and her children from a violent home invasion. Chief Travis elaborated further in interviews, explaining that under Louisiana law, the responsibility falls on a person confronted with this kind of immediate danger to use reasonable force to protect themselves and their family until law enforcement can arrive on scene, and that, in his assessment, this incident fit cleanly within the state's legal definition of justifiable homicide. No arrests were made in connection with the shooting itself. As is standard procedure in officer-involved in self-defense shootings, the case was forwarded to the district attorney's office for a formal review, though investigators were clear from the earliest hours that they viewed the mother's actions as a legitimate defense of her family against a dangerous repeat offender. The human dimension of this case is difficult to overstate. A neighbor, Marquita Hampton, described waking up 2 mornings later to find yellow police tape still wrapped around her neighbor's property, a stark visual reminder of just how close tragedy had come to that entire stretch of Klein Road. Hampton recalled the surreal speed of it all. Within what felt like just minutes of the shooting, the quiet mobile home park had been transformed into an active crime scene. For the mother at the center of this case, whose name authorities have deliberately kept out of public reporting in order to protect both her privacy and that of her children, the incident represents an almost unthinkable violation. Waking from sleep to find an armed stranger standing over her, and having only a matter of seconds to determine whether she and her children would survive the encounter. Robert Rheams, a man with 2 decades of incarceration and a documented history of armed violence behind him, chose that home, on that morning, to continue a pattern that had already cost him 20 years of his life once before. It would cost him everything the second time. If this story moved you, take a second to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case. There are 8 more cases ahead, and each one is just as gripping as the last. Number 3. Joe Horn. A retired computer technician looks out his window and sees strangers breaking into the house next door. He picks up the phone. For the next several minutes, a police dispatcher will beg him, again and again, not to go outside. He goes outside anyway, and by the time police arrive, 2 men will be dead in the street. This is the story of Joe Horn. Pasadena, Texas sits just southeast of Houston, an industrial suburb built up around the oil refineries that dominate the region's economy. A working-class community where homeowners take pride in their properties and where, in the fall of 2007, a new state law had just taken effect that would soon be tested in the most public way imaginable. That law was the Texas Castle Doctrine, which had gone into effect just 2 months earlier, in September of 2007. In broad terms, it expanded the legal protections available to Texans who used force to defend themselves, their homes, and, in certain narrow circumstances, even the property of others, removing, in many situations, any legal obligation to retreat before using force. On the afternoon of Wednesday, the 14th of November, 2007, 61-year-old Joe Horn was at home when he noticed something alarming next door. 2 men were actively breaking into his neighbor's house in broad daylight. Horn did exactly what he was supposed to do in that moment. He called 911. What happened over the course of that call would go on to become one of the most extensively studied and dissected pieces of audio in the modern history of American self-defense law. Over the roughly 20 minutes that followed, Horn can be heard on the recording explaining to the dispatcher that he believed Texas law gave him the right to use deadly force to protect his neighbor's property, an explicit reference to the newly enacted Castle Doctrine. The dispatcher, for her part, tried repeatedly, by some accounts as many as 14 separate times over the course of the call, to convince Horn to remain safely inside his own home and allow responding officers to handle the situation. Horn did not stay inside. He retrieved a shotgun. He went outside. As the 2 suspected burglars, later identified as Diego Ortiz and Hernando Riascos Torres, both undocumented immigrants from Colombia, emerged from the neighboring house and attempted to flee the scene, Horn confronted them. He fired his shotgun, killing both men. Investigators would later determine that both had been shot as they were running away, their backs turned toward Horn at the moment the fatal shots were fired. The shooting became a national story almost overnight, and not simply because of the deaths themselves. The case landed squarely in the middle of some of the most contentious debates in American public life at the time: immigration policy, race, gun rights, and the outer limits of property defense law. Family members of the two men killed were vocal and unequivocal in their belief that Horn had gone far beyond any reasonable definition of self-defense. Stephanie Story, the fiancée of one of the men killed, told reporters in the days after the shooting that Horn had taken the law into his own hands, that he had shot two men in the back after being told, repeatedly and explicitly, to remain inside his own house and let the situation play out without his direct intervention. For more than 7 months, Horn's legal fate remained entirely unresolved. He was not arrested in the aftermath of the shooting. He was not formally charged. Instead, under Texas procedure, the matter was referred to a Harris County grand jury, a panel of ordinary citizens tasked with reviewing the evidence and determining whether Horn's actions warranted a criminal indictment. The grand jury's deliberations stretched across multiple sessions, during which jurors heard testimony, reviewed physical evidence from the scene, and listened to the now infamous 911 recording in its entirety. Legal analysts following the case pointed to a specific and somewhat unusual feature buried within the Texas Penal Code, a provision allowing a person to use force, under certain narrow conditions, to protect the property of another individual, when no other reasonable means exists to prevent that property from being taken or damaged. Adam Gershowitz, a law professor at South Texas College of Law who followed the case closely, explained to reporters at the time that Horn's strongest legal argument rested precisely on this provision: the idea that he had been acting to protect his neighbor's property in a situation where, in his view, no other reasonable alternative existed. On Monday, the 30th of June, 2008, after months of anticipation, the grand jury delivered its decision. It declined to indict Joe Horn on any criminal charge stemming from the deaths of Ortiz and Torres. Harris County District Attorney Kenneth Magidson addressed the outcome directly at a courthouse press conference, acknowledging publicly that he understood the concerns many in the community continued to hold about the way Horn had conducted himself that day, but affirming that, in the grand jury's considered judgment, Horn's use of deadly force did not rise to the level of a criminal offense under Texas law. Reaction to the no-bill decision split immediately and sharply along familiar lines. Gun rights advocates and supporters of expansive self-defense statutes celebrated the outcome as validation of a private citizen's right to protect his neighborhood from crime, even at significant personal risk. Critics were equally forceful in the opposite direction. Houston Chronicle columnist Lisa Falkenberg, writing in the days immediately following the grand jury's decision, argued pointedly that the case had never truly been about gun rights or self-defense at all, that Horn had shot two men from behind, for the sake of recovering stolen property, after having been urged repeatedly to stay inside his own home. She noted that Horn's own defense attorney had, through public statements, acknowledged that his client considered his decision to confront the two men that day to have been a mistake, even as that same decision carried no criminal consequence whatsoever. Nancy Brainerd, one of the 12 members of the grand jury that ultimately decided Horn's case, later reflected publicly on just how seriously the panel had approached its task, aware from the outset that their decision would be scrutinized nationally regardless of which way it fell. More than a decade and a half later, Joe Horn's case remains a fixture in serious legal discussions of castle doctrine and stand-your-ground statutes across the country, not because it represents a simple, clean-cut example of a homeowner defending his own threshold, but precisely because it tested, in the most public way imaginable, how far a state was willing to extend legal protection to a citizen who chose confrontation over caution and who used lethal force not to protect his own home, but someone else's. If you're finding these cases as fascinating as we do, hit that like button, tell us which case has surprised you the most so far in the comments, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case for more deep dives into America's most unforgettable self-defense cases. Number 4. Israel Perez Puentes. She has just stepped out of the shower. She is alone in her bathroom, and in the space of a single breath, the lights go out and a stranger with a kitchen knife is standing in the doorway. This is the story of Israel Perez Puentes. Duluth, Georgia sits within Gwinnett County, one of the largest and fastest-growing counties in the greater Atlanta metropolitan area. A landscape of subdivisions, cul-de-sacs, and quiet residential streets that, for most residents, feel worlds away from violent crime. East Mount Tabor Circle, where this story unfolds, was exactly that kind of street. Unincorporated, residential, unremarkable, right up until the early morning hours of Wednesday, the 11th of May, 2011. At around 6:30 that morning, Gwinnett County Police were dispatched to the address on an initial report of a burglary in progress. What officers found when they arrived was something far more serious and far more disturbing than a simple property crime. A 53-year-old woman living at the residence had just finished showering. She was alone in her bathroom when a man entered, later identified as 33-year-old Israel Perez Puentes, of nearby Alpharetta. According to Gwinnett County Police Corporal Edwin Ritter, Puentes was armed with a kitchen knife and had apparently taken the deliberate step of turning off the lights throughout the home before making his approach, plunging the encounter into darkness from its very first, terrifying moment. What followed was a desperate, close-quarters struggle for survival. The woman, caught completely off guard, fell backward into her own bathtub as she attempted to fight him off. In the chaos, she reached for anything within grasp that might serve as a weapon, at one point using the shower curtain rod itself in a frantic effort to keep her attacker at bay. She injured her back in the fall. Still, Puentes forced her out of the bathroom and into her bedroom. Investigators would later conclude that his intention, based on the totality of the evidence gathered at the scene, was to sexually assault her, using the knife as leverage to control the situation. At one apparent lull in the struggle, the woman offered him money, telling him, according to police, not to hurt her, that she had cash in the house. It was a desperate attempt at negotiation, the kind of instinct that emerges when someone is fighting not just for their body but for time itself, searching for any opening that might change the outcome. That opening came in the bedroom. In the midst of the continued assault, the woman managed to reach her own firearm, a small, .22 caliber pistol she kept in the home. What followed was not a single warning shot, nor a moment of hesitation. She fired 9 times. Every single round struck him. Despite the severity of his injuries, Puentes managed to flee the home through the back door, making it only as far as the backyard before collapsing. Gwinnett County Fire and EMS crews transported him to Gwinnett Medical Center in Lawrenceville, where he was pronounced dead as a result of his injuries. The woman was also taken to the hospital, treated for injuries sustained during the assault and the ensuing struggle, and was expected to make a full physical recovery. In the aftermath, Corporal Ritter offered a blunt, sympathetic public assessment of what the woman had done, telling reporters simply that she had done what she had to do. Investigators moved quickly to establish that there was no indication whatsoever that the woman had any prior relationship with her attacker. This appeared, from every angle investigators examined, to be a random and premeditated act of predation, and detectives began actively exploring whether Puentes might be connected to other unsolved sexual assault cases, not just within the greater Atlanta region, but potentially across other parts of the country as well, given the calculated, methodical nature of his approach that morning. From the earliest hours of the investigation, Gwinnett County law enforcement characterized the shooting as an unambiguous case of justifiable use of force. The woman was not expected to face any criminal charges whatsoever, and the focus of the ongoing investigation shifted almost entirely toward understanding the full scope of who Israel Perez Puentes truly was, and how many other lives he may have already touched with violence before that morning on East Mount Tabor Circle. What continues to make this case so unsettling, more than a decade later, is not merely the brutality of the attack itself, but the sheer vulnerability of the moment in which it began, a woman alone in the most private, unguarded space in her own home, confronted in total darkness by a stranger who had planned his intrusion with enough care to disable the household's lighting before ever revealing himself. It stands as a stark, visceral illustration of how quickly the most mundane, private moments of an ordinary morning can transform into a fight for survival, and a testament to the fact that, in this case, it was the woman who walked away, and her attacker who did not. If you appreciate stories that highlight the courage of ordinary people in the most terrifying moments of their lives, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case. And don't forget to comment below. We read every single one. Number 5. Sarah McKinley. She is 18 years old. Her husband has been dead for 6 days. She is alone in a mobile home with a 3-month-old baby in her arms, and 2 men are trying to break down her doors, one after another, while she is still on the phone begging a 911 dispatcher to tell her what to do. This is the story of Sarah McKinley. Blanchard, Oklahoma is a small town southwest of Oklahoma City, the kind of close, rural community where news travels fast, and where, in the final week of 2011, one family was already enduring more grief than most communities see in a year. Sarah Dawn McKinley's husband had died of lung cancer on Christmas Day. She was 18 years old, and in an instant, she had become both a widow and a single mother, raising their 3-month-old son entirely on her own, in the middle of the coldest, darkest stretch of winter. According to McKinley's own later account, a man named Justin Martin had come to her home once already in the days surrounding her husband's death, on the very day of his funeral, in fact, claiming to be a neighbor stopping by simply to offer his condolences. Something about the visit unsettled her enough that she did not let him inside. On New Year's Eve, Martin returned. This time, he was not alone, and he was not empty-handed. He came back with another man, 29-year-old Dustin Stewart, and this time he carried a 12-inch hunting knife. The 2 men began systematically working their way around McKinley's home, testing door after door, searching for any way inside. McKinley did not freeze. Alone with her infant son, she pushed a couch in front of one of her doors to create a makeshift barricade. She retrieved a 12-gauge shotgun from inside the home, uncertain, by her own admission, whether it would even function properly after sitting and used for more than 2 years. And, for additional security, she also grabbed a pistol. She placed a bottle in her baby's mouth in an effort to keep him calm and quiet through whatever was about to happen, and she called 911. For approximately 20 minutes, McKinley remained on the phone with Grady County Dispatcher Diane Graham while the ordeal unfolded in real time around her. The recording of that call would go on to become one of the most widely circulated and analyzed 911 calls in American history. At one especially harrowing point, as the intruder continued working at her back door, by McKinley's account, at one point striking it with what may have been a hammer, she asked the dispatcher the question that would come to define this entire case. She had 2 guns in her hands, she said. Was it permissible to shoot him if he came through that door? The dispatcher's response, preserved on the recording for anyone to hear, was careful and measured. She told McKinley that she had to do whatever was necessary to protect herself, that she could not explicitly grant permission to shoot, but that ultimately, McKinley needed to do what she had to do to protect her baby. Minutes later, Martin forced his way through the barricaded door, shoving the couch aside. McKinley, standing roughly 22 feet away, saw him enter, and saw something metallic catching the light in his hand. She fired. 24-year-old Justin Shane Martin was killed in the exchange. His accomplice, 29-year-old Dustin Stewart, fled the property. In an unusual turn, Stewart himself placed a call to 911 shortly afterward, telling the dispatcher that he believed his friend had been shot, before ultimately turning himself into authorities. In the days that followed, Blanchard Police Detective Dan Huff addressed the legal reality of the case directly with reporters, stating plainly that Oklahoma law permits a resident to use deadly force against an unauthorized person inside their home, that the statute existed precisely for situations like the one McKinley had faced. Prosecutors reviewed the full scope of evidence and quickly announced that no charges would be filed against her, concluding that their initial review showed no indication whatsoever that she had violated the law. For Dustin Stewart, the legal consequences were far more severe. Because he had actively participated in the underlying crime, the armed break-in that directly led to his own accomplice's death. Oklahoma prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, invoking the same felony murder principle seen in several of the other cases on this list, under which a participant in a violent felony can be held criminally responsible for a resulting death, even without having personally caused it. He was later convicted in connection with the incident, a resolution that came, according to later reporting, roughly 2.5 years after the home invasion itself. Sarah McKinley's story resonated far beyond the borders of Oklahoma, becoming a touchpoint in national conversations about gun ownership, self-defense law, and the particular vulnerability and resilience of women defending themselves and their children while living alone. McKinley herself, reflecting publicly on the decision she made that night, offered a simple and unflinching explanation. The two men had made the choice to break into her home, she said, and she had made the choice that was right for her and for her son. It remains one of the starkest examples imaginable of a life-or-death decision compressed into a matter of minutes. A widowed teenage mother, barely out of her own childhood, forced to become the sole line of defense for herself and her infant son against two armed intruders in the middle of the night. If Sarah's courage moved you the way it moved us, smash that like button, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case so you never miss a story like this one. Number 6. Zach Peters. 3 intruders, dressed head to toe in black, wearing masks and gloves to hide their identities, kicked down the back door of a quiet suburban home in the middle of the afternoon. They believe the house is empty. They are wrong, and within moments, all 3 of them will be dead. This is the story of Zach Peters. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma is a fast-growing suburb of Tulsa, known for its family-friendly neighborhoods and quiet residential streets. The kind of place where a Monday afternoon in late March typically means nothing more eventful than yard work and errands. On Monday, the 27th of March, 2017, that changed in the span of a few violent seconds, inside a home on the 9100 block of South Clearview Drive, just outside the city, in Wagoner County. 23-year-old Zach Peters was home that afternoon with his father. It was an ordinary day, right up until the moment 3 masked intruders forced their way into the residence through the back door. According to the Wagoner County Sheriff's Office, all 3 were dressed entirely in black from head to toe, their faces concealed behind masks, their hands covered by gloves, a level of preparation that investigators believed was deliberately intended to hide their identities and minimize the physical evidence they might leave behind. They were also armed, though not with firearms. Reports indicated one carried a set of brass knuckles, while another carried a knife. What the 3 intruders could not have known, as they broke through that back door in broad daylight, was that the home was occupied. Alerted by the sound of the forced entry, Peters armed himself with an AR-15 rifle and moved toward the back of the house to investigate. What followed was over in a matter of moments. Peters encountered the 3 intruders and opened fire. 2 of the young men, 18-year-old Maxwell Cook and a second teenager identified in various records as either Jacob Redfern or Redfern, were struck inside the home's kitchen. A third, whose age was reported differently across various accounts, ranging from 15 to 17, made it only as far as the driveway before collapsing near the vehicle that had brought them there. All 3 young men ultimately died from their injuries. Deputies who arrived on scene within minutes of Peters' own 911 call determined that emergency medical intervention would not have been able to save any of them. In the days that followed the shooting, investigators worked quickly to establish exactly how the break-in had come together, and it soon became clear that this had not been a spontaneous or random act. A getaway driver, 21-year-old Elizabeth Rodriguez, of nearby Ologa, had driven the 3 young men to the home and waited outside in a vehicle while they attempted the burglary, prepared to drive them away once they had finished. When gunfire erupted instead, Rodriguez fled the scene without them, leaving all 3 behind. She was later taken into custody, and under the same felony murder principle that appears throughout cases like this one, Wagoner County prosecutors charged her with 3 separate counts of first-degree murder, one for each of the young men who died during the crime she had helped plan and facilitate, despite the fact that she had not fired a single shot herself. She was additionally charged with multiple counts of first- and second-degree burglary. Rodriguez was held without bond as her case moved through the courts. In statements to reporters, she acknowledged understanding that Peters had been acting to protect his home, even as she maintained she did not accept full responsibility for the deaths, at one point suggesting, controversially, that Peters could have chosen to shoot the 3 young men in the legs rather than fire the shots that killed them. A comment that drew significant public criticism given the split-second nature of the confrontation Peters had actually faced. For Peters himself, the legal outcome unfolded far more swiftly and far more favorably. Investigators spent the days immediately following the shooting examining the scene in detail, reviewing physical evidence, and interviewing both Peters and his father extensively. On Monday, The 3rd of April, less than a week after the incident, Wagoner County officials convened a press conference to announce the conclusion of their investigation. First Assistant District Attorney Jack Thorpe read a formal statement to the assembled media, declaring that his office had determined Peters acted justifiably and entirely in accordance with his rights as an Oklahoma citizen when he used deadly force to defend his home from the intrusion. He would face no criminal charges whatsoever. Wagoner County Sheriff Chris Elliott echoed that determination in his own remarks, stating plainly that his department supported the right of citizens to bear arms and to defend their homes, and that in this particular case, he believed that is precisely what had occurred. The case ignited intense national debate almost immediately, and that debate has never entirely faded. Supporters framed the shooting as one of the clearest possible examples of legitimate self-defense on record, a homeowner confronted, without warning, by 3 armed and disguised intruders inside his own house, with no way of knowing in the seconds available to him what those intruders ultimately intended to do. Critics, including at least one grieving family member of the young men who died, raised difficult questions about proportionality, particularly given the young ages of some of those involved. One grandfather of a deceased teenager telling a local television station that he considered the confrontation profoundly unfair, given the disparity between an AR-15 rifle and the knife and brass knuckles the teens had carried. Oklahoma's castle doctrine and self-defense statutes, prosecutors were careful to explain, generally do not require a homeowner to calculate, in real time, the precise threat level posed by each individual intruder before deciding whether deadly force is justified, a legal reality that shaped and ultimately determined the case's outcome. What continues to make this case so remarkable is the sheer scale of what took place in what was very likely no more than a handful of seconds. 3 people entered a home intending to steal from it, and 3 people never left that home alive. It remains, to this day, one of the most significant and most frequently cited cases in modern American legal history addressing the boundaries and the very real consequences of using deadly force to defend a home against multiple simultaneous intruders. If this case left you speechless the way it did us, don't scroll past without hitting like, dropping a comment, and subscribing to Midnight Cold Case. We're only halfway through this list, and it does not slow down from here. Number 7. The Forestville apartment shooting. A maintenance worker is forced into his own apartment at gunpoint. He has no idea, in that moment, whether he is going to walk out of it alive. What the intruder doesn't know is that this apartment has a gun of its own. This is the story of the Forestville home invasion. Forestville, Maryland is a community within Prince George's County, located just outside of Washington, D.C. A mix of apartment complexes and residential streets that, like much of the greater D.C. metropolitan area, has weathered its share of property crime over the years. In the early morning hours of Monday, the 28th of June, 2010, one apartment complex on the 4400 block of Reno Road became the site of a violent, high-stakes confrontation that unfolded almost entirely within the span of a few terrifying minutes. A maintenance worker employed at the complex found himself, without warning, at the center of a nightmare. According to police and law enforcement sources who spoke to reporters in the aftermath, an armed intruder confronted the man directly and forced him, at gunpoint, into his own apartment, turning what should have been a place of safety and privacy into the site of an active, life-threatening confrontation. Once inside, the situation escalated immediately and violently. The intruder fired his weapon at the maintenance worker. In that instant, trapped inside his own home, having just been shot at by a stranger who had marched him through his own front door under threat of a gun, the man managed to reach a firearm he kept inside the apartment. He returned fire. The exchange ended with the intruder fatally wounded. Remarkably, the maintenance worker himself emerged from the encounter without serious injury, a narrow, harrowing escape from what could very easily have ended in his own death instead. Prince George's County Police spokesperson Corporal Mike Rodriguez addressed the shooting publicly in the hours that followed, confirming the sequence of events to reporters and offering a clear, unequivocal assessment of the maintenance worker's actions. The man had a weapon inside his home that he used to defend himself, Rodriguez explained, and police believed he had every right to do so. The maintenance worker was not charged criminally in connection with the shooting, and investigators concluded early in their inquiry that the case fits squarely within the bounds of legitimate self-defense under Maryland law. What makes this particular case so unsettling, even set against the other stories on this list, is the specific and deliberate sequence of events that preceded the shooting. This was not a situation in which someone woke to find a stranger already inside their home, nor a case of a burglar caught mid-theft. Instead, the maintenance worker was confronted outside, or very near the threshold of his residence, and forced inside against his will, at gunpoint, by an individual who had clearly demonstrated, from the very first moment of the encounter, a willingness to use that weapon. The intruder fired first. It was only in direct response to that initial shot that the maintenance worker was able to reach his own firearm and defend himself. Cases like this one rarely receive the sustained national media attention given to some of the more widely covered self-defense stories on this list, but they represent something equally significant within the broader legal and cultural conversation surrounding home defense in America. A scenario in which an entirely ordinary person, in the middle of an entirely ordinary night, is thrust without warning into a life-or-death confrontation, with only a matter of seconds to determine how he might survive it. For the maintenance worker at that Forestville apartment complex, those seconds ended with him walking away from the encounter, while the man who had forced him into his own home at gunpoint did not. Prince George's County investigators closed their inquiry into the shooting with a clear and final determination. No charges would be filed against the maintenance worker, and the shooting itself was formally characterized by authorities as a legitimate act of self-defense against an armed and demonstrably dangerous intruder. If stories like this remind you just how quickly an ordinary moment can turn life-threatening, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case. Drop a comment letting us know which case on this list has hit you the hardest so far. Number 8. Eduardo Santos. A homeowner steps outside his own front door to ask a stranger to leave his property. Within minutes, that same stranger will chase him back inside his home, carrying a rock large enough to be described by investigators as a weapon. This is the story of Eduardo Santos. Oakton, Virginia is an unincorporated community within Fairfax County, known for its quiet cul-de-sacs, well-kept properties, and the kind of close, familiar neighborliness that makes an incident of sudden violence feel especially jarring when it arrives. Wapples Mill Road, where this story unfolds, was described by longtime residents as exactly that kind of street, the sort of place where neighbors take walks together, know each other's dogs by name, and have lived side by side for decades without serious incident. That sense of quiet was shattered on the evening of Wednesday, the 9th of November, 2022. Earlier that same day, Fairfax County Police had already responded to 2 separate calls reporting suspicious behavior involving a man later identified as 24-year-old Eduardo Santos of nearby Herndon. On both of those earlier occasions, officers determined that no crime had actually been committed, and Santos, on at least one occasion, reportedly refused to speak with responding officers at all before walking away from the area entirely. By early evening, Santos had made his way onto the property of a homeowner who had lived in that same cul-de-sac neighborhood since 2005. The homeowner noticed Santos on his property and asked him directly to leave. According to Fairfax County Police, Santos responded not by complying, but by assaulting the homeowner with a stick. The homeowner attempted to retreat toward the safety of his own front door. Santos did not allow him an easy path back inside. Investigators say Santos tackled him during the retreat, and the homeowner sustained injuries in the fall that followed. Somehow, amid the chaos of that struggle, the homeowner managed to break free and make it into his house. Once inside, with his wife, his 2 young children, and 1 additional adult resident all present in the home, he retrieved a firearm. Santos did not stop at the threshold. According to police, he followed the homeowner directly into the residence, this time carrying what officers later described as a large landscaping rock, and advanced toward him inside the home itself. Facing a second escalation of the same violent encounter, now unfolding inside his own house, with his family present, the homeowner fired his weapon. Santos made it only a few feet into the residence before he was struck. Officers arrived at the scene within minutes, at approximately 6:08 in the evening. They found Santos suffering from gunshot wounds to his upper body. Despite life-saving efforts by responding fire and rescue personnel, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The homeowner himself was taken to a nearby hospital for treatment of injuries sustained during the initial assault outside and was later released. Fairfax County Police Second Lieutenant James Curry spoke with reporters at the scene that same night, describing the investigation as active and ongoing, but stating clearly that, preliminarily, the department was treating the shooting as an act of self-defense. In the days that followed, as detectives reviewed surveillance footage from the neighborhood and conducted extensive interviews with residents, that preliminary assessment held firm. Investigators publicly stated they did not believe Santos had any prior relationship with the homeowner or any member of his family. This appeared, based on everything detectives were able to determine, to be an entirely random and rapidly escalating encounter with a stranger who, for reasons that were never fully established, had spent several hours wandering that specific residential area earlier in the day before the confrontation turned fatal. The case drew significant local and national attention, not simply because of its outcome, but because of how clearly and dramatically it illustrated the concept of an escalating threat. A confrontation that began outdoors, near a simple request to leave a piece of private property, and ended inside a family home, with a wife and 2 young children present throughout. Neighbors described the shooting as an almost incomprehensible anomaly for their otherwise peaceful street, with several residents telling reporters the incident had prompted them to seriously reconsider their own home security measures in the days and weeks that followed. Detectives ultimately closed their investigation without finding any evidence that contradicted the homeowner's account of the escalating confrontation, and no charges were ever filed against him. For a family that had simply been settling into an ordinary Wednesday evening at home, the case stands as a sobering reminder of just how quickly an encounter with an unfamiliar face on their own street could spiral from a polite request to leave, into a physical assault on the front lawn, and finally into a life-or-death decision made inside their own living room, with their children only rooms away. If you've made it this far, we want to hear from you. Like this video, tell us in the comments which of these cases surprised you the most, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case. 2 more cases remain, and they might be the most remarkable ones yet. Number 9. Christine Jenneiahn. She is 85 years old. She wakes to a masked man standing over her bed, pointing a gun and a flashlight in her face. Within minutes, she will be handcuffed to a chair in her own living room. What her attacker does not know is that this 85-year-old woman is not going to let that be how her story ends. This is the story of Christine Jenneiahn. Bingham County, Idaho, north of the small city of Blackfoot, is a landscape of rural properties and long, quiet stretches of farmland, homes spaced far enough apart that a neighbor's help, in an emergency, might be many minutes away rather than mere seconds. It was in exactly this kind of isolated setting that 85-year-old Christine Jenneiahn lived with her adult son, who lives with a disability, in the early morning hours of Wednesday, the 13th of March, 2024. Jenneiahn was known throughout her community, according to those who spoke about her in the aftermath of what happened, as a warm, welcoming presence, the kind of neighbor known for dropping off homemade cookies to the local sheriff's deputies who patrolled the area. Nothing about her daily life suggested she would soon become the center of a case described by prosecutors as one of the most extraordinary acts of self-preservation they had ever encountered. At around 2 in the morning, everything changed. According to a detailed incident review later compiled and released by the Bingham County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, Jenneiahn was jolted awake to find a man standing in her bedroom, dressed in a military-style jacket, his face concealed behind a black ski mask, pointing both a handgun and a flashlight directly at her. Investigators, piecing together the physical evidence at the scene, concluded that the man, later identified as 39-year-old Derek Condon, of Blackfoot, had struck Jenneiahn in the head while she was still lying in her bed, a conclusion supported by blood found both on her pillow and on the floor of her bedroom. Condon forced her out of bed and marched her, at gunpoint, into her own living room, where he handcuffed her to a wooden chair. He demanded to know where she kept her valuables. When she told him she did not have much of value in the home, investigators say he pressed the barrel of his gun directly against her head. Under that threat, she told him about 2 safes located downstairs. Condon left her handcuffed alone in the living room while he moved through the rest of the house searching for them. It was during that search, according to the prosecutor's account, that Condon made a discovery that appeared to enrage him further. He realized Jenneihann's disabled son was also present in the home. He became angry with her for not having disclosed that fact earlier and began issuing repeated, direct threats against her life. What Condon did not know, could not have known, was that Jenneiahn had already begun formulating a plan. While he was elsewhere in the house continuing his search, still handcuffed to the heavy wooden chair, she began the slow, difficult process of dragging herself, and the chair along with her, back toward her own bedroom, working desperately to reach a pistol she kept hidden beneath her pillow. According to the prosecutor's detailed review of the case, she succeeded. When the confrontation reached its final, violent climax, Jenneiahn, 85 years old, already injured, and still partially restrained, turned the tables entirely on her attacker. She shot him twice with her .357 caliber Magnum revolver. Derek Condon died in her kitchen. But the encounter had cost Jenneiahn dearly as well. She had been shot multiple times herself during the struggle. Badly injured, still partially handcuffed, and alone in the house with her disabled son, she was physically unable to summon help immediately. According to subsequent reporting on the case, it would be approximately 10 agonizing hours before she was finally able to obtain a phone from her son and place a call to 911 herself. 10 hours spent on the floor of her own home, still restrained, in the aftermath of a violent struggle for her own life. When deputies finally arrived at the property, shortly after noon, they found the scene precisely as Jenneiahn had described it to the dispatcher, an intruder dead in her kitchen, and an 85-year-old woman who had, against what most would consider overwhelming odds, survived. Bingham County Prosecuting Attorney Ryan Jolly conducted an extensive, weeks-long review of the case, drawing on Jenneihann's own statements, physical evidence collected at the scene, video footage, and materials obtained through search warrant. His conclusion, made public roughly a month after the attack, left little room for ambiguity. He described the case as presenting an easy, clear-cut analysis of self-defense and justifiable homicide, and went considerably further, calling Jenneiahnn's actions that night one of the most heroic acts of self-preservation he had encountered in his entire career as a prosecutor. He stated plainly that any reasonable person, confronted with the same threat to their own life or to that of a disabled family member in their care, would have concluded that lethal force was necessary under the circumstances. Investigators also worked to establish who Derek Condon was and why he had specifically targeted Jenneiahnn's remote home that night. According to local reporting on the case, officials indicated the two were not entirely unknown to one another, suggesting the attack, while undeniably brutal and evidently premeditated in its planning and execution, was not simply a random selection of an isolated rural residence. Jenneiahn's story drew significant national and international attention in the weeks after it became public, with headlines around the world highlighting both the sheer horror of what she had endured and the extraordinary resolve she demonstrated in surviving it. Prosecutor Jolly, in his official public statement on the case, specifically praised what he described as her grit, her determination, and her unshakable will to live, qualities he credited directly and unambiguously with saving her life. For a woman so widely regarded throughout her community for her warmth and generosity, the attack represented an almost unimaginable violation of the safety and privacy of her own home. And yet, restrained, seriously injured, and facing an armed attacker decades younger than herself, Christine Jenneiahn found a way, against every apparent odd, to survive and to protect her disabled son in the process. If Christine's story left you as stunned as it left us, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case. One final case remains on this list, and it's a powerful one to end on. Number 10. The Oceanside Home Invasion. A man walks along the back fence lines of a quiet residential street, carrying a rock and a wooden stake. He has already tried to break into at least one other home that night. This time, he makes it all the way inside, and directly toward the bedroom where a woman is standing alone. This is the story of the Oceanside home invasion. Oceanside, California, located in northern San Diego County, is a coastal community known for its beaches, its military connections to nearby Camp Pendleton, and its quiet, tightly packed residential neighborhoods. The area surrounding Diamond Circle, off Olive Drive, was exactly that kind of neighborhood, a close cul-de-sac community where, as one resident later described it, everybody knows everybody, and where an unfamiliar figure moving through backyards after dark would be noticed almost immediately. On the evening of Monday, the 29th of July, 2024, at around 7:20 in the evening, that quiet was shattered. According to the Oceanside Police Department, residents in the area had already spotted an unfamiliar man walking along the rear property lines of homes on their street in the moments before the incident began. That man, described by police as a Hispanic male of approximately 22 years of age, was carrying both a rock and what investigators would later identify as a 3-foot wooden stake. Before he ever reached the home where the eventual shooting would occur, the man may have already attempted to force entry into at least one other residence nearby, allegedly hurling a rock through a sliding glass window and shattering it. The residents of that particular home were not present at the time, and investigators were unable to confirm definitively whether he had actually made it inside. The man's next target was a home on Diamond Circle, where a male and a female resident were present that evening. He made his way into their backyard and then into the residence itself, entering through an open bedroom slider door, a door that led directly into a bedroom where the female resident happened to be at that moment. The male resident of the home, upon realizing that an intruder had entered, moved to confront the man directly. In response, the intruder threw the rock he had been carrying directly at the resident's face, striking him. Injured, and now facing an armed and clearly aggressive intruder who had already demonstrated a willingness to use violence, the male resident retrieved a firearm from within the home. He fired 3 shots. One of them struck the intruder in the chest. Police officers and Oceanside Fire Department personnel arrived at the scene within just a few minutes of the initial emergency call. Despite attempts to administer life-saving measures on scene, the intruder ultimately succumbed to his injuries. Officer Heather Mitchell of the Oceanside Police Department addressed the incident publicly in the days that followed, laying out the full sequence of events as investigators had reconstructed it. The intruder's movement through backyards along the block, his forced entry through the bedroom slider, the thrown rock that struck the male resident in the face, and the resident's subsequent decision to arm himself and open fire in response. Out of respect for the ongoing nature of the investigation, the department did not immediately release the identity of either the resident or the intruder, and the shooting was formally reviewed by the department's Crimes of Violence unit as a potential act of legitimate self-defense. The resident who fired the shots was not arrested at the scene, nor at any point during the subsequent investigation. Neighbors throughout the surrounding streets described the unsettling, almost surreal uncertainty of that evening. Several residents, including a couple who had been watching Olympic coverage on television at the time, recalled hearing what they initially believed were the sounds of children playing outside, muffled screaming that only later, once neighbors began knocking on doors and words spread through the cul-de-sac, was understood to be something far more serious. One resident described the eerie coincidence of having purchased home security cameras just the day before the incident, but not yet having installed all of them, a detail that, in the days following the shooting, prompted a wave of security upgrades throughout the entire neighborhood as residents grappled with how close danger had come to their own homes that night. For investigators, this case fit a disturbing but increasingly familiar pattern seen throughout several of the stories covered here. An intruder who, rather than retreating once confronted, chose instead to escalate, closing the distance between himself and a resident, deploying whatever weapon was immediately available to him, and forcing that resident into an immediate, split-second decision between waiting for help that had not yet arrived and acting decisively to protect both himself and the woman inside that bedroom. The Oceanside Police Department's investigation ultimately supported the resident's account of the confrontation in full, and the case was formally closed without any charges being filed against him. One final, striking example, on a night that had already seen at least one other home targeted along the very same street, of just how quickly an ordinary residential cul-de-sac can become the site of a genuine fight for survival. That brings us to the end of this list. 10 homes, 10 families, and 10 nights that could have ended in unimaginable tragedy, but instead ended with the people inside those homes still standing. If these stories have taught us anything, it's that the line between an ordinary evening and a fight for survival can be thinner than any of us would like to believe. If you enjoyed this documentary, please take a moment to like the video, leave a comment letting us know which case affected you the most, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case so you don't miss the next deep dive into America's most unforgettable true crime cases. And if you or someone you know is a young person dealing with fear, safety concerns, or a difficult home situation, resources like Child Help's National Child Abuse Hotline are available around the clock to offer support. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.